In our last two lessons, we looked at texture and dynamics in relation to musical form. Now let's talk about tempo. Like dynamics, tempo is fundamental to musical character. One is only to think of any strong emotion to immediately associate a certain tempo with it. For example, exuberant music will never be very slow, and funereal music won't be fast. A depressing presto seems like a contradiction in terms. Stravinsky is said to have always started composing by deciding on the tempo, and that is easy to understand. This is of course not to say that these tempo character associations are simple recipes. Other aspects of the music also contribute to character, and one could imagine a rather sad piece that was nonetheless in a fairly quick tempo, where, say, orchestration, register, and harmony pointed to the desired character. But in general, if you want an idea how to express a given character, try to imagine how somebody who felt that way would move. Would they slink along? Would they run? Would they be dragging their feet? It's not a coincidence that we speak of the movements in a large piece. Each movement normally focuses on a certain range of character. In fact, we can think of music in general as organized sounds in movement. In classical music, tempo rarely changes within a movement, the main exception being occasional slow introductions that throw a subsequent theme into relief, through contrast. Beethoven started thinking about tempo quite early in his œuvre. Already in the Pathétique Sonata, the introduction returns in the course of the movement. So, instead of thinking of the introduction as a separate section, Beethoven was already considering the possibility of making the tempo change part of the development of a larger musical idea. In his later works, he goes much farther with this idea. When we observe our own emotions, they are sometimes lasting, but sometimes very fleeting. Everyone has experienced a sudden change from feeling sad to smiling, or the opposite. To represent this musically is not a simple matter if the change is not to sound just arbitrary. There are examples of it in opera, where an explicit verbal story makes it easier to understand the character's emotions. But in instrumental music of the classical period before Beethoven, there are no significant examples of multiple emotional tempi within a short time in the same movement. This is an area that Beethoven explores in depth in his later works. Let's look here at the first movement of the 13th Quartet in B-flat major, Opus 130. The first question we need to address is how Beethoven keeps the music coherent while repeatedly changing tempo so suddenly. Tempo is such a salient dimension of the music that drastic tempo changes, if badly managed, can easily sound incoherent. Beethoven has several ways of holding the music together when the tempo changes. 1. Changes occur at meaningful places. When a tempo change occurs, the timing is critical. The basic principle is that it should be coordinated with a meaningful moment in the phrase, like a change of motive, a cadence, or a peak. 2. Smooth voice leading. There are always common tones or stepwise movement across the tempo changes. This contributes a lot to the sense of logical continuity. 3. Harmony. Normally there are no drastic changes in the harmony at the same time as tempo changes. And finally, number 4, return of previous material. When the tempo change brings back something previously heard, the familiarity makes us think, oh yes, instead of, what's that? This technique also makes the listener notice the differences in the way the music continues each time it reappears. Now let's look at the Beethoven Quartet in more detail. At first, this just seems like a normal slow introduction to an allegro movement. Such introductions are normally used to throw the fast theme into greater relief by contrast. This one starts off homophonically and then becomes more contrapuntal in measure 7, reverting to a more homophonic texture again in the last bars before the allegro arrives. The dynamics are also worth noticing here, especially the two crescendi leading to subito pianos in measure 1 and 3. These dynamics help create suspense in the opening phrase. An introduction like this should not be harmonically self-contained, and indeed this one is not. It ends with fermata on a dominant 7th chord. This creates a feeling that the ensuing allegro answers a question posed at the end of the introduction. The allegro presents two complementary ideas, the 16th note motive in the violin 1 and the slower idea in violin 2. Note that, like the introduction, this first main theme features several surprising dynamic changes. Even the start of the allegro presents a sudden change, forte after the preceding piano. Now let's look at what follows, measures 14 to 26. Apart from the dynamic surprises, the music up to this point could have been taken from a much earlier work of Beethoven's. But what happens next is new. The quick idea comes to an abrupt stop in measure 20 on a half cadence. Now the slow idea from the introduction returns, but it's immediately presented in a contrapuntal texture compressed into just 4 bars. Note the way the slow introduction starts on the same harmony as the last chord in the quick section. We recognize the motive and the mood of the introduction, but it's shorter and it has dynamic and tempo surprises both before and after. One reason for its brevity this time is so as not to lose too much momentum in the allegro. At the end of measure 24, the allegro starts again, and it continues until the end of the exposition at measure 93. Once again, in measure 24, the last slow chord at the beginning of the quick section are on the same dominant chord, and the first violin has a common tone. At this point, it's as though the two moods, slow and fast, have changed places. There follows a long period of tempo stability, allowing the listener to settle into this mood. This is quite typical for the exposition of a sonata form. The exposition finishes with a repeat, but the repeat includes the slow introduction. This is not standard practice for a sonata form. Here it again becomes clear that the slow music is not just an introduction, but an integral part of the musical idea. Now let's look at the end of the exposition and the start of the development. Note how the first ending of the exposition loses momentum, gradually transforming the 16th note motive of the fast section into a quarter note appoggiatura in the last bar. This appoggiatura is on exactly the same notes as the beginning of the slow introduction, thus preparing its return. The second ending, leading into the development section, behaves in the same way, but the appoggiatura moves up to become G flat to F. What happens next is important. Having presented a large amount of music containing two different tempi, the development has to somehow follow up. And it does, with a 2-bar reference to the beginning of the slow introduction in measure 95-97. Here it's in D flat major, and it now stops on a 6/4 chord, leaving the listener suspended. Note once again the unusual crescendo into piano, typical of the introduction. The D flat in the second violin of measure 97 then enharmonically becomes a C sharp, and the violins tentatively try to restart the allegro idea in F sharp major. Then the same alternation is sequenced down a third in measure 99 to 103. The last arrival of the adagio tempo is limited to just the appoggiatura motive that end the previous two slow fragments. It repeats several times on exactly the same notes, and then is repeated yet again at the start of the allegro section, which then brings back the repeated 8th note motive and the 16th note motive from the allegro. Note how Beethoven treats the tempo alternation here in a way typical of a development section. It's more fragmentary, it's more harmonically volatile, and the slow moments are generally shorter than they were previously. In other words, the music seems unstable. And that's exactly what a development section normally does. It raises the temperature of the music, making it more intense. Now the music settles down into the allegro material for the longest time so far, as though the more energetic idea has managed to displace the slower material. But having assumed such prominence by this point, it would leave the form unbalanced to simply forget the slow idea. Starting in measure 211, we now get pretty much the same transition we had at the end of the exposition. What follows is typical of Beethoven's mature style. The coda starts like a second development section, returning to the slow introductory material. But instead of beginning a far-reaching harmonic adventure, it quickly turns into repeated cadencing. The music from the introduction comes back in the tonic B-flat major. It arrives at a deceptive cadence in measure 217, then the quick section tries to restart in measure 218. It too arrives at a harmonic surprise in measure 219. This little succession is then sequenced up a step in measures 220 to 221. And finally, again one step higher, we return for the last time to the allegro material in measure 222, ending the movement. Again, both musical ideas include dynamic surprises. The slow music includes the by now familiar crescendo to subito piano, and the last bars of the movement seem to be about to end quietly, but suddenly explode into the conclusive last chords. What's fascinating about this movement is how Beethoven makes formal signposts of these sudden tempo changes, integrating them into a larger whole, creating a powerful expansion of the music's emotional range through carefully organized discontinuity. The repeated alternations between the two tempi intensify the material through contrast effects. There's a lot more to say about this movement, especially about its harmony and phrase structure, but our focus here has been on tempo changes in musical form. And the point, as usual, is the expressive power of Beethoven's innovations. Our next lesson will be about tempo changes in other composers.